Have you ever taken a language class and just wondered why you were doing what you were doing? Maybe your Spanish class was all about grammar drills, but your friends was just talking. Well, today we're digging into the powerful theories that actually shape how languages are taught.
Right? It's a great question. Why is it that some classes feel like boot camp with endless drills while others are all about free-flowing conversation? Is one right and one wrong? Well, it turns out the answer isn't random at all. It's actually rooted in some really big ideas, foundational theories about how the human brain acquires language in the first place. So today, we're going to explore the major thinkers whose ideas have shaped classrooms for decades. It's kind of like a story of how our understanding has evolved over time. And our story really kicks off with B.F. Skinner. He was a psychologist who saw language learning not as some big mental puzzle, but as something way more straightforward, a simple, almost mechanical process of forming habits. His core theory was called operant conditioning, and it works like this, a simple, repeatable loop. You've got a stimulus, like a teacher asking a question. Then you have a response, the student's answer. And finally, reinforcement. The teacher says correct or gives a good grade. The idea is that this positive feedback solidifies the response, turning it into a habit. So if you've ever done those repetitive grammar drills or memorized dialogues until you could say them in your sleep, you have absolutely experienced Skinner's influence. This way of thinking led directly to methods like the audiolingual method, which was all about that kind of mechanical practice.
So really what it all boils down to in Skinner's world is this. Language isn't some complex cognitive skill. Nope. It's simply a verbal behavior, and you train it just like any other behavior, through repetition and reward. But then came the revolutionary challenge from the linguist Noam Chomsky. He looked at Skinner's very neat, very mechanical model and basically said, no way. There has to be something much more complex going on inside our heads. And this table just perfectly illustrates that central conflict. Chomsky argued that language is just way too complex to be learned by imitation alone. I mean, think about it. Kids say things they've never, ever heard before, like, I gooed to the store. They're not imitating, they're applying a rule. And with that, he completely shifted the focus from external behavior to our internal cognitive wiring. He actually proposed that we are all born with something he called a language acquisition device, or LAD for short. The best way to think about it is like a built-in operating system for language, already preloaded with a kind of universal grammar that helps us make sense of whatever language we hear around us. So, the fundamental shift that Chomsky brought to the table is this. Learning isn't just about mimicking what you hear. It's a creative, cognitive process where our brains are actively built to decode the underlying system of a language. Okay, so after Chomsky totally opened the door to thinking about the mind, Stephen Krashen came along and added some really crucial human elements, focusing specifically on how we learn a second language. Krashen developed this hugely influential theory that's built around 5 core hypotheses. And together, they form a model that really changed the game for a lot of teachers, shifting the focus away from just conscious study to the magic of natural acquisition. His most famous idea is probably the input hypothesis. He argued that we acquire language in basically only one way, by understanding messages we hear or read, and that comprehensible input, as he called it, needs to be in a sweet spot, just a little bit beyond our current level. He even had a formula for it, I+1. He also made this really critical distinction. On one hand, you have acquisition, which is subconscious. It's like how a kid just picks up their first language. On the other hand, you have learning, which is the conscious study of grammar rules. Krashen's big point, only true acquisition is what leads to real fluency. And that brings us to his most powerful takeaway. For real acquisition to actually happen, the learner's affective filter, their anxiety, their stress, their self-consciousness, it has to be low. This was a revolutionary idea, and it connects directly to what we talk about today with psychological safety in the classroom. A relaxed, confident learner is basically an open channel for that input to sink in. This brings us to the constructivists. These thinkers built on those cognitive ideas, but they saw the learner not as some passive sponge just soaking up information, but as an active architect, literally building their own understanding, brick by brick. The psychologist Jean Piaget, for example, argued that learning is completely developmental. What a child can grasp about language depends entirely on their cognitive stage. It's why you can't really teach abstract grammar concepts to a 7-year-old. Their brain is still thinking in very concrete terms. Now, while Piaget kind of saw the learner as this little scientist figuring things out on their own, Lev Vygotsky came along and argued that learning is fundamentally social. He gave us this amazing idea called the zone of proximal development, that sweet spot, that gap between what a student can do all by themselves and what they can achieve with a little guidance from a teacher or even a classmate. So the key takeaway from Vygotsky is that learning is a team sport. Language isn't just a subject you study in a book, it's the very tool we use to build understanding together through conversation and collaboration. So, okay, we've gone on this whole journey, from behavior to the mind to social learning. What does this all mean for a teacher in a classroom today?
Well, the best teachers don't just pick one theory and stick with it. They build a toolkit. They're like master chefs, picking the right ingredient for the right moment. They might use a Skinner-style drill to nail down a tricky pronunciation, but then switch to a Vygotsky-inspired group project for collaboration. They'll keep Piaget in mind by choosing age-appropriate tasks, and make sure their reading material gives students that crucial Krashen-style comprehensible input. It is all about mixing and matching with intention.
And that right there is the core message. When you know the why behind the methods you're using, you can adapt, you can make informed decisions. You're no longer just following a script, you're conducting an orchestra. Because it's not one or the other. True effective language learning is a synthesis of all of these powerful ideas. It's shaped by our habits, our minds, our emotions, our developmental stage, and our social world, all working together. And that leaves us with one final thought. Now that you know the history, now that you know the why, what's the one thing you might do differently tomorrow, either in your classroom or maybe even in your own learning?